Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the Cultivated Detective podcast. And this being the second episode might possibly seem a little bit surprising, since it will likely be the first episode that is uploaded as part of this podcast series, but there are various reasons for this, because actually this episode can be seen as episode 1, episode 2, or episode 3, depending on how you count it. And there's a very good reason for this, and well, I actually recorded 2 other episodes. One that I plan to use as an episode 0 that had various introductions to the podcast series and so on, some thoughts on what I was planning to do, and then an episode 1 where I put parts of these ideas into practice. Unfortunately, the second episode, or rather episode 1, was well, the audio quality wasn't great, and it was very long, so I eventually gave up trying to have it made into a usable quality, and instead I decided to record this episode where I will talk a little bit about the first two episodes and so build the basis for the upcoming episodes that will hopefully be uploaded in the future. And so if you start with what I called episode 0, well, what I basically talked about was the main part of what I talked about was wanting to do some kind of solo RPG sessions in Sherlock Holmes universe, the world of Sherlock Holmes. Playing as Sherlock Holmes and Watson, trying to solve various mysteries. And I discussed various limitations and alternatives for doing this, and basically what I came up with was using some kind of AI text model for keeping track of the secret parts of the mystery, and then I would act as a player and a DM and handle the PlayStation that way. Of course, it would perhaps have been better to play with someone else, but well, for various reasons, that's not practical, and doing it this way, well, it makes it possible to experiment a little bit with these AI text models to see how good they actually are. So it's interesting on multiple levels. And that was really much of the first episode, episode 0. So the basic concept, or rather idea, that I had when thinking about trying to do this is that, for those that have back in the day played text adventure games, such as those from Infocom and other companies, they might be familiar with the idea of using a text-based interface for interfacing with a story. And those old school adventures, well, they had a fairly primitive set of commands, not necessarily all of them, but you had a fairly fixed structure as to how you could phrase the commands you use to talk to the game. For example, if you were outside the window and there were some footprints on the ground in the grass, you could say examine footprints, and the game will provide you with a description of the footprints, if that had been added to the game. And that's the basic structure. You had a predefined set of commands, and you had a predefined set of objects, and you had a predefined set of characters and locations. And interacting with these, well, that was something that was programmed into the game by the developers. So you went to the story of the game as one would in any other game, but instead of using a mouse or a joystick or whatever, you use the keyboard. And all the responses were in text, at least for most of the games. There were some graphics also, but primarily the gameplay was entirely text-based. And by using an AI model, you can, to a certain extent, emulate that. The biggest difference, or one of the significant differences, is that first of all, you don't have to limit yourself to a very specific syntax. You can describe the actions of the character in free form. And secondly, well, there's really no predefined set of actions and locations and characters and so on. You will ideally at least have this generated or be presented as you go along. And that can, of course, be both a positive and a negative. The positive is that, well, you are free to do most anything that you can imagine. And the drawback is, of course, that without having a fixed structure where you have a developer creating a story, a narrative, and ensuring that this story has a proper start, middle, and end, and ideally also a satisfactory end, well, this would not be the case for, or at least not necessarily the case for, an approach that uses an AI model, since there is really no guarantee that you will reach a proper conclusion, and that conclusion and the road you took to reach it will be equally satisfactory as one that was pre-generated by a human. That's at least the thoughts that I had going into this. And then I did an actual play session. I did some experimentation first. I tried out the basic idea of having a model generate a mystery for me, and I would not look at what it generated, but instead supply the generated mystery with the prompts that I sent to the model as I made them. So in theory, the model will keep track of the details of the mystery, and it would respond with responses that were consistent for the world that it had generated for the mystery. And I will be free to sort of explore that world as appropriate. And I did some experience with a Poirot mystery, so I generated a mystery where Poirot was on a cruise ship. So I had very short one-line summary for the mystery. I think it was the title that I provided to the model as basis for generating a structure for the story, and it then filled out a predefined structure containing elements such as characters that were involved, what the nature of the mystery was, and the locations that were relevant, and so on. So, for example, you could have whodunit aboard a cruise ship, which is also I tested on. And that worked quite well. I didn't complete that session to the end, but I started playing, and the title of the mystery was The Mystery of the Burnt Croissant, if I remember correctly. And the model had created a mystery where there was a person that died during the breakfast session on the cruise ship. So he was eating breakfast and he got a croissant that was burnt, and since it was burnt, he wasn't able to taste that it had unusual taste because, well, it contained poison, and he tragically died there at the breakfast table. And in this case, the mystery was related to this person that died having discovered that there was a set of people who were selling and buying, well, probably primarily selling counterfeit art on the art market. And this person had discovered this, found out the identities of some of the persons involved, and he was then presumably murdered by some of the people involved. And, well, I don't know how that mystery would have gone, but it showed quite a lot of promise as to how this thing could be done. So I put it into practice with a mystery starring Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and that's what I recorded for episode 1 of this podcast series. And the short summary is that that was unexpectedly entertaining. I didn't really know what to expect when I started it. I had experimented a little bit with this type of thing, so I had, in addition to the Poirot story, I had tried some months earlier to generate a world, you could say, where I explored a traditional British mansion, and I walked around in the different areas around outside of the mansion, and I went into the mansion itself and looked at all the rooms and so on. And this was very entertaining. Many obscure and interesting details, but it totally broke apart when I reached context or token limit of the model. And at that point, it no longer made consistent sense. So it showed very much promise, but it was a flawed experience, to say it like that, one could say. So I wasn't entirely certain what to expect when I started this Sherlock Holmes mystery. The most uncertain aspect was whether to realistically expect there to be a proper ending or not. Would I be able to successfully complete that was consistent with the mystery that was actually generated when I started? That was the most uncertain part of the entire process. And then there's, of course, the question of how much internal consistency there would be. So you need to have characters act in a way that's consistent with who they are, their relationships to other characters, what they have seen, what they know, and how you act, and so on. If the model simply returns random text that seems appropriate based on the context around it, well, if that context is too small and the text that is returned is not really logically consistent, well, it won't be very entertaining, and I would have to do a lot of cleanup and I would have to handle most of the direction of the story myself. And at that point, there's not much point in using an AI model, really. So, not knowing how things would go was somewhat interesting. And since I didn't really know how things would go, I chose to record the entire thing in one session, or rather in one long episode, or rather what was meant to be one long episode. But since the audio quality ended up not being too great, well, I ended up having to scrap the whole thing. But before I came to that point, I had a really enjoyable experience. It was quite a lot of fun. And part of the fun was that, it actually was somewhat challenging. So you have some kind of mystery, and if it's a whodunit type of story where somebody has been murdered, well, you have to find out what happened, and you have to find out who the murderer is, and when you have done so, you have to collect evidence and then either present this evidence to the law so they can have the thing, or confront the persons that are responsible and try to have them confess to their nefarious deeds. And the thing about this is that, well, the model was quite good at having these characters reluctant to admit to anything, if not pressured to do so in some kind of way. So I had to go through all the steps of building a case, collecting evidence, talking to witnesses, examining crime scenes, and so on, in order to find out what happened, and then be able to have enough information that I could get even more information by pressuring witnesses and so on. So there was a very much unexpectedly challenging aspect to this game session that I was very pleasantly surprised at experiencing. And if I think back, the story itself and the text that I wrote and that I had returned from the model, well, it wasn't most elegant prose, perhaps, and I don't think the resulting story will dethrone Shakespeare anytime soon, but the core point is that it was actually amusing and entertaining. And part of this is that, in contrast with these text adventures, as I noted earlier, there is really no limitations on what you can do. You can write in free form, and rather than being limited to commands such as examine room and so on, talk to person and so on, you can do whatever you want, really. So you are entirely free to take the story and the investigation, in this case, in the direction that you want. And partly, I guess that's what I did, and I ended up with getting results that were fairly much in line with what one would expect based on the story and the world as it was generated. So that was also quite pleasant. Of course, it wasn't a perfect experience. There were problems, quite a lot of problems, and there was some need for manual editing of the responses from the model before I fed the next set of actions from Sherlock Holmes and Watson into it. But overall, this wasn't really a big problem, but it's useful to know that this is not really a extremely polished approach. So even though some of the problems that I encountered can probably be fixed by how the mystery is generated and in the commands to the AI model that are set when the prompt is sent to the model, there are still limitations that need to be addressed by hand. Of course, What I used was a local model, which is probably not as advanced and fancy as some of the commercial online models. So that's also a consideration. I could possibly have had a more consistent experience and one that required less manual intervention if I had used a commercial model from one of the online vendors. But for various reasons, I wanted to use a local model, not only because I wanted to see how well this would work, but also because, well, if you look at the nature of the story, it consists of, people planning nefarious deeds and so on, and that might not necessarily be what you want to direct a model that's online to do for you. So instead of fighting with an online model to have it return the kind of text I want, I instead used a local model that provided me with a more consistent and carefree experience. And well, another limitation is, of course, that the response speed on the local model is probably slower than it would be if I had used an online model. And again, that's a choice that I made, and well, it was not really a problem. But it's something to be aware of if one wonders if this is something one wants to try out for oneself. So it's not as polished as the experience one gets if one downloads one of the traditional Infocom games, for example, and try to run those. So not perfect, but still very much entertaining. So I must consider that to be fairly successful with regards to how much worse it could have gone. And part of what I thought I'd do in this episode is to provide a short summary of the events of this first episode and the mystery that I played to, since there were some interesting elements in it that, even though the mystery as it was has been completed, there are some things that I think could be built on. So I'm thinking of doing a continuation of the story from the first mystery and to make it a little bit easier to understand for anyone that wants to try to follow the gameplay session if I do record and upload it. Well, having a short summary available will probably be convenient. That is why I will retell the story of Sherlock Holmes and the adventure of the crossed daggers, because that was what the adventure was called. And it starts with Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in their apartment. And Sherlock Holmes is standing by the window looking out at the street, plucking away at his violin distractedly. And Watson is sitting by the table, reading through today's newspaper for perhaps the fifth or sixth time. Because, as is often the case, they have had a period of very little work, and both of them are waiting for somebody to come knock on the door, so they might have some kind of challenge to occupy them with. And as they are sitting there, they can actually hear someone knocking on the door downstairs. They can hear Miss Hudson talking to what appears to be a woman, and eventually they can hear footsteps on the steps and a knock on the door, and Miss Hudson introduces a young lady that wants to talk to Sherlock Holmes. And Watson, he gets quickly up and invites the young lady in, and he clears away the remains of one of Sherlock Holmes' experiments from one of the chairs in the room, and invites her to sit down. And, well, both he and Sherlock can easily see that she appears to be carrying some kind of deep sorrow. She looks like she is in grieving. Sherlock Holmes, for his part, he observes her more closely, and he can see that the clothes she are wearing, they appear to be of fine quality, possibly very expensive at the time of purchase, but they look like they have been used for some time, so possibly she is of a high upper class, but perhaps not from a family that is wealthy. And then Sherlock Holmes sits down opposite her, and he asks her what he can do to help her. And she explains that she is the niece of a Dr. Henry Lee. And Dr. Henry Lee was murdered a few days ago in the study of his home, a little outside the center of London. And both Watson and Sherlock Holmes can recall reading in a newspaper about a brutal murder that had occurred in a mansion outside London. The article in the newspaper had very little detail, but it was obvious that it had been some kind of violent, possibly ritualistic murder that had occurred. And she explains that her uncle was murdered, and well, of course, the police are investigating, but she is worried whether the lead investigator and Inspector Lestrade is able to find the murderer or not. So, this Inspector Lestrade, he is apparently convinced that her uncle was murdered during a robbery gone wrong. For her uncle, he was a dealer in antiques, so he bought and sold and also privately collected antiquities, and he had an extensive collection at home. And the murder weapon was perhaps one of the more valuable, or at least famous, items from this collection. A pair of daggers that were called the Dagger of the Gods. And these daggers had been used to murder him, and they were thereafter placed crossed on his chest. And that's the way he had been found. And there's not only the way he was murdered, but also some events leading up to the murder makes her suspect that he was not simply the victim of accidental crime or robbery gone wrong, but rather that there was somebody that wanted to kill him, and she wants the murder found. And that is why I have come to you, she says, because I have heard rumors of your extraordinary talents when it comes to finding out what has happened in these types of cases. And well, both Watson and Sherlock Holmes are, well, not really busy at the moment, so they both appreciate the opportunity to be able to not only have something to do, but also to be able to help this young woman who is obviously very distressed. So Sherlock Holmes asks to tell them more about what happened on the night of the murder and why she thinks that there is something more to this case than what Inspector Lestrade suspects. And she says that, well, the night of the murder, I sometimes stay at my uncle's place, and that was the case this evening. And there wasn't really anything very special that happened. My uncle has a company together with a business partner, James Parker. And James Parker had been to the house of Dr. Lee for dinner, and they had eaten together and talked. And after dinner, they had gone to the study of Dr. Lee, and they had apparently had some kind of argument. They had not agreed over something. She didn't know the nature of this disagreement, but you could hear from their voices and the way they talked that there was some kind of disagreement between them. And then around 10 o'clock, this James Parker had left the house, and she had gone to bed, and next morning she had been awoken by the housekeeper, Mrs. White, who had found the body and called the police. And as to why she suspected that there might be something else, well, there was not only the strange ritualistic nature of the murder, but the daggers that were used to end the life of her uncle, well, they were very valuable. So if it had actually been somebody who wanted to break into the home of Dr. Lee and his study in order to steal from his collection, well, why would they leave something so valuable behind? It really didn't make sense to her. There's also the fact that her uncle had appeared to be quite agitated and distressed, worried about something in the last days leading up to his death. So she suspected that there was some other kind of activity, some other kind of motive for her uncle's death than simply financial gain. And that is why she had come to Sherlock Holmes. And he simply nodded and asked her to tell him a little bit more about the people that were in the house and who she thought might possibly be involved in this affair. And she told him that, I sometimes stay at the house. Then there's Miss White, the housekeeper, who has been with the family for many years and really is the backbone of all that is going on in the house. And then there is Emma, a young maid who has been with the house for a couple of years now and is very much cheerful and helpful and a pleasant member of the household. And then there is the gardener, a Thomas Brown, and Thomas Brown also seems like an okay person. He was hired a couple of months earlier, so he hadn't really been long at the house, but he seemed to be doing a good work, and he was perhaps a little bit of a loner, so didn't really spend that much time with other servants, but she didn't really know anything suspicious or such like regarding him. And then there was a Mr. Edward Black, a rival collector of Dr. Lee, who apparently had at several occasions tried to purchase the Dagger of the Gods from Dr. Lee, and each time he had been rebuffed by Dr. Lee. But he had still insisted in trying to purchase these items, and not that long before the night of the murder, Dr. Lee and Mr. Edward Black had, in some kind of public place, been observed arguing about something, most likely about the collection of Dr. Lee and the items that Mr. Black wanted to purchase. apart from this, she didn't really know of anyone that would likely be involved or could in some kind of way be responsible, at least that she knew of. Sherlock Holmes asked about Inspector Lestrade and why he had this theory of this being a robbery gone wrong. And well, she said there were apparently some kind of footsteps outside the window to the study. Somebody had walked near the window, and this was likely at the night of the murder. So Inspector Lestrade's theory was that somebody had gone up to the window at the night of the murder and had broken into the window and attempted to steal the dagger of the guards and possibly some other items, and then had been caught red-handed by Dr. Lee. The thief had panicked, and Dr. Lee had ended up being dead. And then the thief had fled again through the window. That was his theory, but Denise, she was not convinced that this was what had happened. And well, this didn't seem like a case which could be solved from the apartment of Watson and Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock Holmes said that yes, we will take this case, and thank you for providing us all this information, and we will now go visit the mansion and observe the crime scene and talk to the relevant persons ourselves. And Denise thanked them both and then was led out to the door by Dr. Watson. And here I think I'll end it for now. There's still quite a bit left of the story, but I'll leave that for another time. And part of what I hope to do with this episode is to see if I have managed to work through some of the audio issues, and hopefully, if that's the case, I will be able to upload this episode and continue with a new episode at a later time. But for now, thank you and goodbye.